Welcome to Rising Up for Justice, a special weekly series presented by Rising Up with Sonali, an independently produced subscriber-supported program syndicated to radio stations, free speech TV, and podcast platforms. I'm SonaliKolhatkar, host and executive producer. Our nation and our world are overrun by billionaires and bigots, but they are few and we are many. On this series, exclusive to subscribers of Rising Up with Sonali and viewers of Free Speech TV, you'll hear conversations with changemakers in the movements for social justice and dig into the nuts and bolts of values, strategies, tactics, narratives, and building power. This week on Rising Up for Justice, my guest is Jeff Cohen, columnist, activist, former journalism professor, and author of Cable News Confidential. He founded the media watchdog group FAIR in 1986 and co-founded rootsaction.org in 2011. Welcome to the program, Jeff.
Great to be with you, Sonali.
So you are here to talk about FAIR, which stands for Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. It is a very valuable institution that I have relied on, whose work I've relied on over my couple of decades doing this. Tell me, and for our audience who aren't familiar with FAIR's work, what it is and what its main goals are.
FAIR monitors media, does studies of media bias and censorship and exclusion. They've done it for 40 years. They're celebrating their 40th birthday at FAIR. I was the founder. I'd say the three goals are: number one, to spread the word that people should be skeptical of mainstream media, be on the lookout for bias and censorship. I think we've particularly taught critical news consumers that they have to always pay attention to sources and experts, which sources and experts are in the story and which have been excluded from the story. So that's number one, is teaching skepticism about corporate news media. The second goal of FAIR has always been to spur media activism against bias, against exclusion, against censorship, and against the corporate takeover of media. And the third goal of FAIR has been to support independent journalists, independent news outlets that operate outside of the conglomerated media. And Sonali, you're one of those journalists that FAIR tries to bring attention to as doing journalism the right way, as opposed to what passes for journalism in the conglomerated, dominated news media.
There are organizations who will critique right-wing media. And indeed, I think most people who are liberal-minded in this country understand that outlets like Fox News are deeply problematic. But interestingly, FAIR tends to focus on Fox News' enemies, the so-called liberal media. And I'm wondering if you can interrogate that a little bit, because often FAIR picks up on things, on biases, on assumptions that even I, as a seasoned journalist, might miss. And then I see, because you guys are the experts, and then I see FAIR's analysis and I realize the built-in assumptions in outlets like the New York Times or NPR. So how do you explain that to people who think that the Times and NPR are on the right side of media coverage?
Well, they may think that until they see that FAIR has critiqued the New York Times since 1986, public broadcasting since 1986. Who are the experts? Who aren't? Who's excluded? What are the biases? So people that have been reading FAIR stuff, FAIR.org, know. I mean, at the New York Times, when we started in the 80s, they were putting forward so many myths about the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. And FAIR would chronicle how in the US-supported regimes of Central America in the 80s, like El Salvador, like Guatemala, when opposition figures were murdered, half dozen of them, it would be on the back page of the New York Times. But if the Sandinista government, a left-wing government, detained right-wing Contras after they'd met with the Washington, supporters of the right wing, after they'd met with people in Washington who were supporting the Contra war, and they'd be interrogated at the airport in Managua, Nicaragua for a few hours, that was front page news. Now, unless you're doing this kind of scrutiny, as FAIR does, you might not know that. FAIR did a study of public TV NewsHour and how it had a white male conservative guest list. And unless you studied months of the NewsHour, if you just watched it once in a while on PBS, you might not know that. But when FAIR does this study, it's overwhelming that when it came to foreign policy, the NewsHour at PBS kept relying on a militarist think tank called the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And when they discussed economics and politics, they were relying on the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative corporate funded think tank. There are many think tanks in Washington, but on public TV, you are only hearing from these conservative think tanks. And the left of center think tanks were largely excluded. With public radio, FAIR did this report on how, and this is typical of public radio, it's typical of the New York Times, it's typical of public TV. And I teach people, and FAIR has always taught, when you hear a former government official only identified as a former, you're probably being lied to. Because these people that get on TV and radio and in the New York Times over and over and over, who used to be assistant secretaries of state, deputy secretaries of defense, former members of Congress, former chief of staff for presidents, what they are doing today is far more important than what they might have done 5, 10, 15 years ago. So at public radio in the 90s, when healthcare was being debated, healthcare reform, you had a former Democratic Congress member allegedly debating a former Republican Congress member, and both of them were dismissing out of hand the idea that single payer, what's now called Medicare for all, might be a good idea. They just dismissed it, both of them, the former Democrat Congress member and the former Republican. What the listeners were not told until FAIR made a stink of it, and we actually bought a quarter-page ad in the New York Times. What listeners of NPR did not know is that both former Congress members dismissing Medicare for all were currently consultants or lobbyists for-profit corporate healthcare interests. And I would argue that that's important information for the listeners to know. So that's the only way that you become skeptical of what we call the corporate centrist media or the corporate liberal media, is if someone's doing this kind of in-depth research and doing these long studies of who's getting on the air, who isn't, who's being quoted in the New York Times, who isn't. And unless someone's doing that for you, it's easy to think, as you said, Sonali, that these corporate outlets of the center are somehow on my side, and they're vastly different than Fox News.
Right.
And it's a huge myth. And I would argue, if there's one thing I can leave your viewers and listeners with, listen to how often, or when you're reading the Times or the Washington Post, someone's just identified as a former Obama chief of staff, a former top aide to President Clinton, positions they had 5, 10, 20 years ago, and they're not identified by what they're doing now. Like when CNN would bring out Jim Messina, not the singer, the political operative, and he would bring him on in the 2020 election. He was always bashing Bernie Sanders. He was just introduced as a former Obama campaign manager. What CNN didn't tell their viewers, and you wouldn't know it, is that Jim Messina was currently a consultant at the highest level for Uber, for Amazon's pharmaceutical division, for all these big corporations that Bernie Sanders was critical of. So if Jim Messina had been properly identified by CNN, people would say, oh, okay, this guy's a corporate guy, corporate consultant guy. I understand why he hates Bernie Sanders, who's critical of these big businesses on behalf of consumers and on behalf of workers. But CNN didn't tell them. So it's, just always be wary when someone's identified merely as a former official.
So it's really interesting to think about the fact that these reasonable sounding media outlets are in fact protecting the status quo, one that doesn't work for most Americans. Let's go back to the beginnings of FAIR. FAIR, as you said, is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year, which is remarkable. Congratulations to you, to the FAIR team. But tell us that story of how and why you founded FAIR. What was the inspiration for realizing that there was a need for such an organization?
Well, there had been a right-wing media watch group, a media bashing group. They hated journalists almost on principle. It was called AIM, Accuracy in Media. And they would get meetings with the New York Times publisher, and anyone who was doing decent reporting in mainstream centrist outlets would be attacked by Accuracy in Media. So that existed before FAIR. And in the mid 80s, we had this declining warmongering President Reagan, who'd made jokes on a hot mic about nuking the Soviet Union. The coverage of Reagan in the New York Times, in public broadcasting, and they kept telling us how popular he was. He actually wasn't a very popular president. Compare him to others, he wasn't. But there was this myth of the hugely popular Reagan. And the corporate liberal outlets were on bended knee. There's a whole book about it called On Bended Knee by Mark Hertzgaard. So that was the beginning of FAIR, that I couldn't believe how the corporate liberal or corporate centrist, whatever you want to call them, media were just soft. They were as soft on Reagan, who was a really dangerous individual, as they were later soft on Biden a couple years ago. And then there was another factor. Entertainment conglomerates were taking over the news. Giant corporations, the media were concentrating in the hands of fewer and fewer big corporations. The good news, Sonali, and you're a big part of this, is that independent, non-corporate news is growing, and people are finding their way. You obviously don't have advertising budgets. Democracy Now! Doesn't. The Young Turks don't. But millions of people are now getting their news. This is almost unheard of. Every day, almost every hour, from non-corporate sources. So that's the good news in today's media environment.
So just to kind of clarify for our audience, FAIR it's a small outlet. You've got researchers and writers whose entire job it is to read these supposedly centrist liberal that often end up being right-wing and protecting the status quo media outlets that have reputations for being fair, and you analyze them, you find the patterns, you publish studies, you publish reports, you publish data that allows people to see through what's really being reported. And then what? How does that help fuel change? How do people use, or how does FAIR itself use its own work to pressure these outlets to do better?
Well, that's where activism comes into play. We call it media activism. When Reagan was making jokes about blowing up the Soviet Union and all its inhabitants, our slogan was better media active than radioactive. So if people go to the top of FAIR's website and click on email network, they'll become one of tens of thousands of media activists that gets this hardcore research from FAIR, and FAIR makes it very easy for you to then send an email to the New York Times or complain to NPR that they've got two people debating healthcare, and both of them work for the for-profit healthcare industry. So that's the key is, a lot of it is shame. when you're talking about mainstream media, you have to shame them, these corporate centrist outlets. I remember when FAIR did its first study of Ted Koppel's Nightline, which was the most prestigious show on ABC News. And we found that the guest list, through studying 40 months, 865 different shows, that the guest list was dominated by white male conservatives and militarists and racial minorities, and their advocates were largely excluded. Labor was totally excluded. So when you see these kinds of studies, it empowers activists to raise hell. And the other thing FAIR has always been good about is attacking, say, television news in the mainstream dailies. When we attacked NPR for their phony debate on healthcare reform, we bought a quarter-page ad in the New York Times. And on that morning, I got 3 calls from NPR executives claiming that they're going to change things because we had shamed them. When we did the study of Nightline, a mainstream daily in Pennsylvania ran a news story about a wire service story about our study, very accurate. Here's what the study found. Here's the biases of Nightline on ABC News. And the caption, they showed next to the wire story, they ran a photograph of Ted Koppel with a very unusual segment they had done trying to explain economic terms, and they had used the Muppets. So the picture was Ted Koppel with Kermit the Frog. And this is a mainstream daily, not an alternative counterculture weekly. The mainstream daily, using FAIR's research, has a caption, Ted Koppel of Nightline making one of his rare appearances with a representative of a minority group, meaning Kermit the Frog. So, and there was a Black columnist in mainstream dailies who started referring to Nightline as White Line. And so I think that's the key, is media activism can shame these outlets that purport to be operating without fear or favor, like the New York Times, or PBS, NPR saying that they're public, media, but acting some ways like the private media and excluding the same progressive points of view that the corporate outlets are excluding. And I think what FAIR has done is they've taught activists to be skeptical and to take action. And then, just as important, support independent news outlets. If you know of good news independent outlets, whether it's FreeSpeechTV, Rising Up with Sonali, and you know that your friends and neighbors and relatives don't yet know about it, use your social media, use your email, spread the word, because Sonali does not have a multi-million-dollar advertising budget like CBS News does.
And that is a great segue to ask you about the question of how you tell the story of why these news media outlets behave the way they do, right? Because that helps to understand what their agenda is. Why do they protect the status quo? How do you connect the business model, the profit-based motives of the New York Times with its coverage?
Well, we've done studies of who's on the New York Times corporate board, and it interlocks with the most powerful corporations, healthcare industry, military companies, that might explain why the Times editorial position is not progressive on those issues. So, I worked at MSNBC. I was on the air at Fox News. I was on the air at CNN. I saw things from the inside. There are often good journalists, producers at the bottom level, some of them very young. They went into journalism to, afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted, and to expose power and illegitimate power and the misuse of power. But they're working in what I learned at MSNBC especially, which is now called MS Now. These are strict corporate hierarchies. Like when I was at the Phil Donahue show, on primetime MSNBC, I knew who my boss was. I knew who she answered to, the head of MSNBC. I knew who he answered to, which was the guy who was placed in to run NBC and NBC News from General Electric, which owned the whole thing. And he had come out of the plastics division of General Electric. So, I mean, in a short answer, Sonali, why do these corporate liberal outlets tilt against labor, tilt against environmentalism, tilt against progressive change, tilt against democratic socialists? It's because they are part of big corporations. Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. He's right wing, he's allied with Trump. Ellison owns half the media. He's there at the White House talking about who's going to be fired at CNN after he takes over Warner Brothers Discovery. But at the New York Times and even public broadcasting, look at their funding. In other countries, public broadcasting is well funded by the taxpayer, and they don't have to go running to big corporations as sponsors, which they call underwriters. So, I mean, what we've done at FAIR is we follow the money. And my long-winded answer, Sonali, why do corporate liberal or corporate centrist outlets protect the status quo? A lot of it is follow the money. These are corporate institutions. These are institutions that do not want to rock the boat. I mean, and you know, if I could talk about the good news.
Yes, always.
Yeah, I know that's what you're about, Sonali. The good news is that there's a generation gap, that older people rely on legacy media, including liberals, and they think that they're getting liberal or neutral news from the New York Times and public broadcasting and TV news. And then you have people under 40, under 45 who are getting their news elsewhere. During Gaza, they were getting a lot of news from TikTok. That's why Ellison, a 110% Zionist, has moved to take over the US operation of TikTok, the billionaire from Oracle. So the good news is that young people, and you could go issue after issue, are avoiding legacy media, going to independent media, using their social media. And there's this generational gap on what people believe and what people want for the country. Like in New York, I was very active, early supporter. Roots Action was the first national group to announce its support of Zoran Mamdani for mayor. And in New York media, the legacy media, the TV channels, the New York Post, of course, owned by Rupert Murdoch, right wing, and the New York Times were telling you why you should fear Mamdani. And young people didn't buy it, in spite of, you know, huge amounts of money in commercials and these news outlets telling us why we should fear Mamdani. People under 40, under 45 weren't even getting that news. And they overwhelmingly not only voted for Mamdani, but volunteered for Mamdani by the thousands and thousands. And the other issue is Gaza. I mean, young people are not hearing CNN apologize for what Israel's doing in Gaza. They're not hearing CNN and others telling you that the anti-Israel, the anti-genocide encampments on campuses, well, they're really sort of anti-Semitic, aren't they? That's what was said week after week on CNN. I mean, my daughter was in the encampments, 100% Jewish, as were many of the activists at the encampment. It wasn't about anti-Semitism. It was about stopping genocide. And young people have a very different view on Israel and what Israel did in Gaza because they weren't hearing all the apologies from mainstream media, allegedly corporate liberal media. So, I mean, there's good news. And the good news is independent news is growing. Can it compete with corporate liberal media? No. Is it anywhere close to the huge corporate right-wing media? No, but it's growing.
And I also should mention that FAIR has its own radio show. You have a publication that you put out called Extra. There's a lot of things to explore. So let me close with asking you, Jeff, how can people get involved in supporting FAIR's work? And also, who are FAIR's natural allies in the social justice landscape? Is it just other sort of media organizations, watchdog organizations? Do you ally yourselves with social justice groups? Where does it fit in, and where can people link up?
I think FAIR sees itself as allied with social justice movements. And FAIR has taught from the beginning that if your main issue is racial justice or police misconduct or immigrants' rights or opposing US empire and militarism, or labor or feminism, whatever your main issue is, your second issue should be dealing with media bias and becoming media active. So I encourage people to go to fair.org, sign up to be at the upper right email network, and you'll see that no matter what makes you listen to Sonali or what motivates you to watch FreeSpeechTV, whatever those issues are, you should also have an issue that I've got to be a media activist and not just a racial justice activist or a peace activist or an environmental activist or a feminist activist. So that's, I think, what FAIR has brought to the table, is to try to mobilize people to do those three things: be skeptical about corporate media, whether it's liberal or right wing, become media active, challenge media bias and exclusion, and then three, do everything you can to build independent, non-corporate media.
Well, Jeff, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and really appreciate your time. Fair.org is where you can find out more about FAIR's work. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sonali.
My guest has been Jeff Cohen. He's a columnist, activist, former journalism professor, and author of Cable News Confidential, and he founded the media watchdog group FAIR in 1986. He's also co-founder of rootsaction.org. This is Rising Up for Justice, and I'm SonaliKolhatkar, host and executive producer of this new weekly half-hour series, exclusive to viewers of Free Speech TV and subscribers of my long-standing program, Rising Up with Sonali. You can find out more at risingupwithsonali.com.